Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see all of you this morning. It's an episode of a new thing, like we always are excited to do on these mornings. Jeez, my hair is always out of whack. Not helped by this hideous light, but whatever. This is why maybe we need to invest in a studio. In any case, I hope you like data. Uh, I'm not a huge fan of math, but some interesting study recently came out, and I think it's worth taking a look at it. So, we're going to take a look at that today, especially because it's important on how we view evangelism, maybe how we should think about where we're at in the world and things like that. So, what I want to look at with you guys is a study today. But first, let's look at the Bible because I'm going to set this up for us with a few verses. So, we're going to be looking at two verses or two, I should say, sections from the book of Acts. So the first is Paul in Athens. This is Paul preaching to a group of Greeks in the Areopagus, but I first want to just read it and kind of show you what I'm getting at here. So it starts off, it says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, What does this blabber wish to say? Others said, He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling and hearing something new." So just to let you know, the Areopagus is this section of Athens, overlooking the Acropolis, where a bunch of people would meet to discuss and debate and things like that. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man and every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that this divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. In times of ignorance, God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed the day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, We will hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Alright, so that's the first thing we looked at. What I want to point out here is that in this section, Paul is evangelizing to a group of people who are very educated, and his argument reflects that education, right? So he's actually quoting Greek philosophers and poets here. So for instance, the first quote comes from, they think in the ESV anyway, probably Epimenides of Crete. He's a philosopher. And then a poet, Aratus's poem Phaenomena, right? So these are pagan philosophers and poets that he's quoting. It's interesting, right? He's matching it to the audience, people that his audience would know. Of course, he gives the story of God and creation, things like that, but he does it within a sense of pointing people towards Jesus, right? Okay, so that's that. Next, we're going to look at another section of Acts, and this is Acts 14, starting in verse 8 here. And this is Paul and Barnabas who are traveling around, and they arrive in a place called Lystra. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice to the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men, of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them. In the past generations he allowed the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them. All right, so here's another story with a different group of people. Lystra's a little bit more of a rural place. Here they are mistaken as gods who have come to visit. And this is something that would happen in Greek mythology. There's this idea that the gods would go around visiting places, especially Zeus and Hermes, kind of these travelers. And this is what they think is going on, right? Because this guy has just been miraculously healed in front of them. You can imagine in their worldview, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? And you'll notice that Paul's argument is almost, in a lot of ways, very similar to the argument that is being made in the Athens passage, but he's matching it to the people, right? He doesn't say, "Oh, well, let me quote some poets or scholars," right? Instead, he's just using the natural world around them, right? He says, "Well, look, like it's clear that God exists from the rain, and He's been doing all these things for you. Don't do it," right? So they're trying to give him a different take on what's going on, but the people, continue to try and offer sacrifices to them. I bring this up because it's important to see that at this point in time, the gospel message, I don't want to say was tailored as in changed, but the presentation of it was tailored depending on where this person was from, what their intellectual background is, what they believe, right? And Paul is doing this with all these different speakers. Presumably, this is being done in Greek. I'm not quite sure what Lycaonian is. It could be a native dialect of that area or something else, but I'm not too concerned with that. I think it's clear from what Paul is saying that he's speaking in Greek, because that was kind of the lingua franca, so they would have understood that. Plus, they're worshiping Greek gods, so my imagination is they probably were understanding that. In any case, why do I bring this up? Well, we had a pretty big study that just happened, and that was released. This is the Religious Landscape Study. So this happens, the last time this happened was about a decade ago, in 2014. And it's a study that Pew Research Center does, a research center that I think has a very good methodology and is usually, I think, by most people treated as a very well-done survey series. And they focus on a lot of things, but religion is one of the main things they focus on. And so in 2007, 2014, and 2024 slash 2023, when they started collecting a lot of the data, they have done these religious landscape studies to show general trends in the American people when it comes to religion. And this one has been really interesting. In some ways, things haven't changed, but in other ways, things are changing, and it's kind of interesting to see that. So first things first, I'm going to put the main link to this in the comments, not in the comments, sorry, in the description. So if you want to go through and click through it yourself, you can see the United States, and you can see the general percentages of affiliation here, but then you can go state by state. So like you can go to stuff to get to New Jersey, because we're sandwiched in between New York and Philadelphia there, but you can click on New Jersey, and you can see here it says 59% of New Jersey people identify as Christian, 12% as other, 27% identify as religiously unaffiliated. And you can do that by city, and you can even look at all New Jersey data here, right? And it'll kind of pull it up, and we'll give you all sorts of political views, things on that, right? So really helpful when it comes to looking at the ideas or general trends of people in your area. Really helpful, right? Like all of this stuff you can go through. Probably something we'll do as a church uh, in our in our outreach committee. I think would be very helpful for this. In any case, right? So we have a bunch of data that you can search through here, but when you go down, you can see kind of just more breakdown. And I love the visualization here. It really helps you kind of tease things out. So it says 62% of U.S. adults identify as Christians, and then breaks it down by group. Of course, I know why they're included, because they identify themselves as Christian, and Pew is a non-sectarian organization will just say, all right, if you identify, then you're included. But obviously, like, Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't be included as Christians, but whatever. You can see they're a small part of the population anyway. So we have evangelical Protestants who've been far ahead. Protestants in general, probably, let's see here, 30-something percent, 40% maybe, depending on what that shakes out to with the percentages. And then Catholic, 19%. So 62% of Christians, percent of adults identify as Christians, which is interesting. And again, you can go through all these different things, right? And you can just see kind of general things. But here's what I actually like. And so this is kind of an article they released with it. And I think it's very interesting, right? It says, decline of Christianity in the U.S. has slowed, may have leveled off. Of course, you always need to take into consideration that demographics are not destiny. That just because they look or happen a certain way doesn't mean that that's guaranteed forever. But this is really, really important, and something that I've been thinking about and kind of predicting to people. I actually think that the percentage of religious people is going to rise as time goes on, based on other studies that I've seen from Barna and things like that. The reason being is that I think we have a meaning crisis right now, and people are eventually going to try and find it. But there is stuff in this survey that complicates that. For anyway, right? So decline of Christianity has slowed, may have leveled off. That's really interesting. You can see here is a graph. In the first one, religious landscape study, you'll see 78% of U.S. adults identified as Christian, and then 71% in 2014. So you had a pretty significant drop there. And then you had another significant drop when they started doing kind of phone call interviews, and even more a few years ago, 62%. But then it's bumped up to 63%, which of course is not some huge, it's not like, 80% or something like that, right? But the idea for a long time amongst sociologists, especially like secular ideologists, is that religiosity would just continue to decline and decline and decline and decline until religion has died off, right? This was the idea for a very long time in parts of academia and other places in society. But that's clearly not the case. In fact, we might be starting to see a reversal. And so you can see that this is a pretty big deal, because this has been the story of religion in the United States for basically my whole lifetime, as long as I can remember. So it's really important that we see that this has been the first time that this has been an upwards trend. Of course, they've only, and I shouldn't say only, because this is actually quite a bit by survey standards, but they've interviewed 36,000, almost 37,000 U.S. adults, which is a pretty large study, right? That takes a lot of time and effort to do that sort of thing. And you can go through this article, and it'll go through a bunch of things, but actually, I want to go to the executive summary. So this is like the big things that they think is really important. So firstly, just the general ways that people are affiliated, right? 40% Protestant, 19% Catholic, 3% is others. And then you have the about 30% are unaffiliated, 5% are atheists, 6% are not agnostic, and 19% identify as nothing in particular. That's the spiritual but not religious crowd, is my guess. And then 7% belong to religions other than Christianity. 2% are Jewish, and 1% each are Muslim, Buddhist, or Hindu. and all figures are rounded, so they just round up or round down, whatever. And there's also have felt fairly steady. So amount of people who pray daily, 33% go to religious services at least once a month. Since 2020, the percentages saying this have consistently hovered in the low 30s, right? And by the way, for our church, right, I just want to, right, is that we've, as people, give yourselves a round of applause, have done a wonderful job of staying consistent and going to church, and you should. So I'm very happy with that. Large majorities of Americans have a spiritual, supernatural outlook. And so they point out that, most people believe in a soul, 83% believe in God or a universal spirit, 79% believe there is something spiritual beyond the natural world, 70% believe in hell, heaven, hell, or both. But in future years, we may see further decline. So they're not just saying that this is guaranteed that it's come back. And again, all this is may language, right? They're not. One of the things I appreciate about the obvious, the humility of this study, I should say, is that they're just saying, listen, we may see increase, we may see decrease. They're not, pumping everything up, but they're also not saying everything is bad or whatever, because, they're noticing certain trends. It says young adults are far less religious than older adults. Again, this has been a common trend, I would actually say, throughout human history. I think that this is the normal one. I think the thing is not to see necessarily attendance of young adults, but mostly, worldview, because I think that's going to affect them when they actually start getting a bit older, right? No recent birth cohort has become more religious as it has aged. So this is looking backwards, right? The fact is that you have two young generations right now where it's hard to tell what's going to happen, sort of thing. The stickiness, this is the ability to stay in religious upbringing, seems to be declining. Seems, right? So they don't know, but they think that that's what the case is. Compared with older people, fewer young adults who had a highly religious upbringing. I'm wondering how they define that. I'm sure they do somewhere in the I'm sure it's somewhere in here, but I'd be interested to understand what that is. Still highly religious as adults. The stickiness of non-religious upbringing seems to be rising. So, like, if you were raised as a non-religious person, chances are you're going to remain that way. Right? And this is the third time Pew Research Center has conducted a religious landscape study. The first RLS was conducted in 2007, the second in 2014. Other new findings from the new study include, different changes in percentage. The non-denomination, right, is growing. Denominational populations have shrunk. This is not really a surprise. Here's what's interesting, I think, is to me, this isn't a surprise. Maybe that's a surprise to you, but if you talk to the average American, right, where they're not very concerned with theology, which is kind of the formation of denominations, and like ethnic background as well played a big role in denominations, and that's become, as people, especially these denominations that come out of Europe, as the American population has begun to integrate with each other through marriage and children and stuff like that, right? People aren't going to feel as attached to certain theologies or ethnic belongings as they would in the past. Of course, some people still very much are, but not guaranteed, right? All right, anyway, it says women remain more religious than men in the United States by a variety of measures, such as prayer frequency and belief in God and the universal spirit. But, and this is really interesting, the gender gap in religiousness is less pronounced amongst younger adults than among older people. And it's slightly smaller today than in 2007. Still, women in every age group are at least as religious as men. That's really interesting, and something I've talked about before on this channel, right? That young men seem to be much more interested in religion than previous generations. Kind of interesting. Political ideology. The share of self-described political liberals who identify as Christians has fallen 25 percentage points from 2007, from 62 to 37%. This isn't surprising. I mean, you don't really have to see why this is surprising. You can look at the general trends of the Democratic Party, kind of their focuses, and also kind of the, and this is just what I've noticed, I'm fine to have a conversation with someone if they viewed otherwise. But I think uh, skeptical, uh, anti-religious at some point stance, and I don't think this is because they're inherently haters or whatever. I think it's because they're matching the energy given off by the Republican Party, which, even though right, identifies itself really strongly with Christian values. You'll notice here that the Christian share in the Conservative Party have also decreased as conservatives, right, who identify that way, from 89% to 82%. This is political ideology, not theological ideology. If it was theological, I'd be actually really interested in how that shakes out. But I don't think they take that into account. You probably have to really dig into the data to kind of see some trends on that. This is also not really a shock. 66% of adults who attend religious services say that most or all people in their congregation have the same race or ethnicity they do. Even more say this was true of religious services they attended as children. I mean, that shouldn't be surprising, especially looking backwards. It still shouldn't really be surprising today. Unfortunately, people tend to segregate a lot of the times when they are not in, and I believe not in like a purposeful, maybe like racist way or something like that, but people tend to just gravitate towards people that are like them in modes of worship that they're comfortable with, and a lot of that has to do with culture and ethnicity, right? So that's not really surprising. I mean, Martin Luther King back in the 60s, when this was much higher percentage, right, said that the most segregated hour is like 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning or whatever, right? But this is something that goes multiple ways, right? Pretty much every American, every believer in the United States could do something about this. It doesn't just fall to one group who do this sort of thing, right? So, immigration status: the majority of U.S. immigrants are Christian, but there are 14% belong to others, and it lists there. And you can go through all these bunches of pages here. Here's what I wanted to look at. This is also pretty interesting. So you can see here that this is of people who attend religious services at least once a week. 93% of them are Christian. But here's the kind of interesting thing, right? Is if you go to if you go to like seldom or never, you can see the change that this has happened here, right? So 38% of people who never go identify themselves as Christian. And the reason I bring this up is to turn us back to these points, right? Which is, all right, how do we reach these people? Because looking at studies like this should just give us an idea of where we want to go and how do we reach other Christians, right? Or, and of course you could look at people a few times a year or once or twice a month or whatever like that, right? But like 38% of people who never attend a religious service, right, identify as Christians. This should be 100% of this, in my view, right? We should really want people who, I mean, we should obviously reach out to the religiously unaffiliated as well, and to other religions, right? But the interesting thing here is that there are 38% of people who culturally identify, and I would call this, say, cultural identification would be the strongest factor here, who identify as this but don't come to church. How do we reach them in a serious way? And what does it mean? You know, how would we speak to them about being a Christian in a way that is compelling to them? Because obviously, to us in a church who go every week, we've made the intellectual, you know, or faith assessment to say this is something I believe. I want to be a part of this community. I'm going to go here once a week to worship. I'm going to make it part of my daily life, right? But that's a very different kind of worldview or understanding of it than someone who never goes but says, oh yeah, I still actively identify with this. Some of it, I'm sure, is cultural. Especially, I know many people who kind of are like that with a Catholic understanding. It's kind of a cultural thing. But even so, right, like this is about a lived life. So how do we reach those people? And this is why, like, it's so interesting to look at maps like this and click around and see how people identify, because it's going to impact how you reach certain people, right? Class, ethnicity, background. These are important things to take into consideration when you're doing evangelism. And so I'm very thankful today for some of the positive things to report, and even the negative things, in the sense of like this gives us an idea of what we need to work on. Like I'm glad that there's organizations like this that do these studies to help us actually focus on what we need to do. So I would suggest like you go around and see like what is going on in different parts of the U.S. See what it's like in different cities. I think the highest city population that I found was Charlotte, where it's 73% identify as Christian, which is crazy. And I think the lowest was like Portland. Let's see, 42%, or Seattle, 44. Yeah, it was Portland. Which this area of the nation has always been very, not always, I should say, but has come to represent kind of the most unchurched, is what people call it, region of the United States, the Pacific Northwest, and New England as well. Like, let's just see like what Maine is. Yeah, well, Maine's 51%. That's 1.5. 45. All right, New York, Vermont 45. So yeah, actually comparatively, Washington and Oregon, 51% and 43%. Oregon, we need to lock in. We need to lock in on Oregon. All right. We need to get out there and see some. Oh, let's see Las Vegas. It's for fun. 61% of people in Las Vegas identify as Christian. Yeah, it's hard not to think about it without the the strip. Maybe outside of that, there's a Zion on the outside of that, and just the Sodom and Gomorrah right in the middle there. Who knows, right? In any case, really interesting stuff. I hope you found that interesting. Maybe you're not a data nerd. I mean, I'm not really either, but I think that this stuff is really important for how we interpret the world around us and how we bring the gospel to people. So that's all I wanted to talk about this morning. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I'll see you on Sunday for worship. Peace out.